The playground encounter. The Saturday morning sun stretched lazily over the city, casting golden light through glass towers that pierced the skyline. For most, it was just another weekend, another day to relax, shop, or escape the grind of the week. But for Maya Carter, CEO of Carter Innovations, every day was a battle. Her life was measured in stock reports, board meetings, and the relentless ticking of the clock. Yet today was different. Today was not about power lunches or multi-million-dollar deals. Today was about her daughter, Ella. 6 years old, small and fragile, with wide hazel eyes that seemed too wise for her age, Ella had not spoken a single word in 2 years. Doctors called it selective mutism brought on by trauma. Therapists insisted patience was key, but for Maya, each silent day felt like a lifetime of helplessness. She had built empires with her voice, negotiated contracts that reshaped industries, and convinced armies of investors to believe in her vision. Yet she could not coax even a whisper out of her little girl. That morning, Maya had stood by the window of their penthouse apartment overlooking the city. Ella sat on the carpet, clutching her favorite stuffed bunny, staring out at the world below. The sight pierced Maya's heart. She realized how rare it was for Ella to smile, how the joy of childhood seemed to have been stolen away before it could fully bloom. "We're going out today," Maya said softly, though she knew no answer would come. She crouched beside her daughter and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Somewhere you might like." She dressed Ella warmly, wrapped her coat around her, and for once left her driver behind. Today was not about arriving in a chauffeured car. Today was about being human, being present, being a mother desperate enough to try anything. She chose the neighborhood park, a place she had not visited in years. But, leaving maybe the sight of other children, the rhythm of swings creaking, and the laughter in the air might stir something in Ella's silent world. The playground was alive with energy when they arrived. Children darted across the grass, their voices rising in shrieks of excitement, chasing soccer balls and climbing jungle gyms. Mothers gathered on benches, chatting, sipping coffee, their laughter mingling with the sounds of play. Maya felt out of place, her tailored coat and expensive heels a stark contrast to the casual warmth around her. But she held Ella's small hand and guided her toward the sandbox. Ella sat quietly at the edge, drawing invisible shapes in the sand with her fingers. Maya watched with the aching knowledge that her daughter should have been shouting and running like the others, not trapped in a shell of silence. It was then that Maya noticed him. A tall man with broad shoulders and skin the shade of deep bronze, wearing a faded jacket and jeans, stood by the swings pushing a young boy who laughed freely as his feet kicked at the sky. The man's face carried lines of struggle, but also a gentleness rare in the city. His laughter was unguarded, rich and infectious, and he cheered his son as though he were the most important person in the world. Maya could not look away. He was so different from the polished men she encountered daily in conference rooms and five-star restaurants. There was no arrogance, no performance, only genuine joy in being present with his child. When his son hopped off the swing, the man crouched to the boy's level, listening intently as the boy explained something with rapid gestures. Then the man glanced around, his eyes resting briefly on Maya before shifting to Ella. Maya felt a jolt of unease, as though he could see through her mask of control to the exhaustion underneath. She quickly turned her gaze away, pretending to focus on her phone, but it was too late. The boy had wandered over to the sandbox where Ella sat. He plopped down with an easy grin and offered her a small red toy truck. "Want to play?" he asked, his voice filled with the simplicity of childhood. Ella hesitated, her fingers curling around her bunny tighter, but she did not turn away. For Maya, even that hesitation, an acknowledgement of another child, was more reaction than she had seen in weeks. The father followed, standing at a respectful distance. "Mind if he plays here?" he asked, his tone polite, warm but cautious. Maya nodded stiffly, unsure what to make of him. "Go ahead," she said, her voice clipped from habit, the tone she used in boardrooms rather than playgrounds. But the man did not seem offended. He simply knelt in the sand beside his son, making a show of driving the truck across the dunes of sand as though it were crossing mountains. His deep voice narrated a story. The brave little truck is on a mission to deliver supplies across the desert, but oh no, the storm is coming. His son giggled, joining in with sound effects. To Maya's astonishment, Ella's eyes followed the toy. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something. Maya's breath caught, her pulse racing. Could this stranger really be reaching her child in ways that she, her therapists, and endless specialists could not? The man noticed too, but did not push. He kept playing, his voice weaving stories that filled the silence. The truck is brave, but it's a friend to help it through the storm. Maybe a bunny who knows the way? He glanced at Ella's stuffed toy, his eyes kind, inviting her to join. To Maya's shock, Ella reached out, pressing her bunny gently into the sand beside the truck. The boy clapped his hands in delight. The man smiled broadly but still said nothing to force her. Instead, he let the moment breathe, allowing Ella to step out of her silence in her own time. Then, so quietly Maya almost thought she imagined it, Ella whispered, "Storm." One single word, raspy and fragile, but a word nonetheless. Maya froze. The air around her seemed to stop moving. Her daughter, mute for years, had just spoken. The man looked at Ella, his eyes wide with surprise, then softened into something like pride. He did not react with shock, did not overwhelm her with questions. He simply said, "That's right, the storm is strong, but the bunny and the truck can be stronger together." He kept playing, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, protecting Ella's fragile courage. Maya's eyes filled with tears, her throat tightening. For 2 years she had waited for this, prayed for this, begged for this. And it had not been doctors or expensive clinics or her own desperate coaxing that unlocked Ella's voice. It had been a stranger in a worn jacket, a man who seemed to carry more kindness than the world usually allowed. As the children played, Maya found herself studying him, wondering who he was, what kind of father had such patience and magic in his voice. She wanted to ask his name, to thank him, to understand how he had reached into her daughter's silence so effortlessly. But for that moment, she stayed quiet, afraid to break the fragile miracle unfolding before her eyes. For the first time in years, hope bloomed in Maya's chest, fragile and trembling, but alive. And so, in the middle of an ordinary playground, on an ordinary Saturday, the extraordinary began. A father's heart. The sound of children's laughter still echoed in the air when Daniel Evans leaned back on his hands, watching his son build sandcastles beside Ella. He could see the shift in the little girl, subtle but unmistakable. She was no longer staring at the world with blank silence. Instead, her hands moved with purpose, pushing sand into small mounds, her bunny tucked firmly under her arm, as though it too were part of the game. To most parents in the park, this might have been nothing remarkable, just 2 kids playing together. But Daniel had caught it. The tremble of her lips, the shy whisper of a word. He didn't know her story, but he didn't need to. He had lived long enough to recognize when a child was carrying a weight too heavy for their small shoulders. He stole a glance at the woman on the bench, the girl's mother. Even from a distance, Daniel could tell she was not like the others at the park. Her coat was finely tailored, her posture too upright, her eyes sharp and restless, as though even here she was analyzing a roomful of investors. Yet beneath that polished exterior, he noticed something else, a weariness, a quiet desperation in the way she watched her daughter, as though she was clinging to the hope that something, anything, would break the silence that bound the child. He recognized that kind of desperation. It was the same kind he had seen in the mirror years ago, when his own world had collapsed. Daniel's life had not been simple. Once he had been a high school history teacher, known for bringing dusty textbooks to life with stories that made students lean forward in their seats. He had loved the job, loved watching light spark in young minds, but life had taken from him more than he had ever imagined. His wife, Leah, had been the heart of their little family. She was vibrant, always singing around the house, filling the air with warmth and joy. When cancer claimed her 3 years ago, Daniel had been left to raise their son, Marcus, alone. For months afterward, he had woken in the night to the sound of Marcus crying, clutching a pillow where his mother should have been, and Daniel, broken himself, had to find strength where none seemed to exist. Money had quickly become another battle. Teaching no longer paid enough to keep them afloat. Bills piled up, hospital debt loomed, and Daniel made the impossible choice. He left the classroom and took a job in construction. It was hard, physical work, backbreaking at times, but it paid more. Each day he left before dawn, muscles aching, and returned home late, his hands calloused and scarred, but he always made sure Marcus never saw the burden he carried. What Marcus saw instead was a father who laughed, who told bedtime stories, who still found time to bring life into play. Daniel had sworn that if life had robbed his son of a mother, then he would not let it rob him of a childhood too. That promise had reshaped Daniel. He had learned patience when Marcus acted out in grief. He had learned to listen to the silences as much as the words. He had learned that children, more than anything, needed presence, not perfection. And so, in the playground, when he saw Ella's silence, he recognized it not as defiance, but as pain. He didn't need to know the details. He only needed to offer the same thing he offered Marcus every day: gentle steadiness, an invitation to be herself without judgment. As the children played, Marcus leaned close to Ella and asked, "What's your bunny's name?" Ella blinked, her mouth opening slightly, but no sound came. Daniel quickly filled the silence. "Maybe the bunny's name is a secret," he said with a conspiratorial grin. Marcus nodded with excitement. "A secret agent bunny, on a mission." He zoomed the toy truck through the sand again, and Ella smiled. A tiny, fleeting smile, but enough to make Maya stiffen on the bench. Daniel caught the mother's expression, saw the way her hand trembled slightly as she brushed her daughter's hair back. Eventually, Marcus tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, can we get ice cream?" His voice was bright with anticipation. Daniel chuckled. "After you finish building that castle. A mission isn't complete without finishing the fort." Marcus groaned but set back to work with enthusiasm. Ella continued to watch, her fingers digging trenches beside his. Daniel stood slowly, brushing sand from his jeans, and finally approached the woman on the bench. "Your daughter's wonderful," he said, his voice calm and genuine. She looked up sharply, as though startled by the intrusion, then studied him with those piercing eyes. Up close, Daniel saw that she was younger than he expected, maybe mid-30s, but her face carried the weight of someone who had fought too many unseen battles. "She's quiet," she replied carefully, her tone guarded. Daniel nodded, not pressing. "Quiet doesn't mean she isn't strong. Sometimes the quiet ones see more than the rest of us." Something in his words made her pause. Most people, she realized, either gave her pitying looks or rushed to suggest treatments when they saw Ella's silence. This man offered neither. He spoke as though Ella's quiet was not a flaw but simply a different kind of strength. "I'm Daniel," he added, extending his hand. After a slight hesitation, she shook it, her grip firm but cool. "Maya," she replied simply. They sat in silence for a moment, watching their children. Maya felt strangely unsettled by him. He was not polished, not wealthy, not part of her world of power and strategy, and yet his presence was steady, grounding, like an anchor in a storm. She wanted to ask how he had drawn that word from Ella, how his son laughed so freely in his company, how he made it look so effortless when she, with all her resources, had failed. But pride held her tongue. Daniel, sensing the wall she had built around herself, did not press further. There. He knew walls well. He had built his own once after Leah's death, but he also knew children had a way of slipping through cracks adults never noticed, and he could already see that Ella had slipped through his. As the sun dipped lower, Daniel gathered Marcus. "Time for us to go, buddy," he said. Marcus protested but obeyed, waving at Ella. "See you next time." Ella clutched her bunny tighter, her lips moving faintly as though forming words she wasn't ready to share. Maya stood, smoothing her coat. She wanted to thank Daniel, to express the impossible gratitude rising in her chest, but the words stuck. Instead, she watched him walk away, hand in hand with his son, his frame strong against the glow of the setting sun. That night, as Maya tucked Ella into bed, she thought of his words. Quiet doesn't mean she isn't strong. For the first time in a long time, Maya allowed herself to believe her daughter's silence was not the end of her story. Somewhere deep inside, a door had cracked open, and the man named Daniel had turned the key. The Clash of Worlds. The following week passed in a haze for Maya Carter. Her days were consumed, as always, with board meetings, negotiations, and the endless rhythm of managing Carter Innovations, a corporation sprawling across continents. Yet beneath the polished speeches and carefully tailored suits, her mind kept drifting back to the playground, to that moment when her daughter had whispered a word for the first time in 2 years, to the stranger in the faded jacket whose quiet patience had cracked open the silence that no doctor or therapist had managed to breach. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She had invested thousands of dollars into specialists and cutting-edge therapies, flown Ella across the country to clinics staffed by the best minds, and yet it was in a neighborhood park with a man who looked like he had come straight from a construction site that the impossible had happened. By Friday evening, the thought weighed so heavily on her that she found herself staring at her reflection in her office window, the city lights glittering behind her like fallen stars. Her assistants had left for the night. Her desk was covered in files demanding her attention, but all she could think of was Ella's fragile voice whispering, "Storm." It had been like hearing sunlight after years of shadow. She had wanted to cry, to shout, to hold her daughter and never let go, but fear had kept her silent. Fear that it might vanish as quickly as it had come, that if she celebrated too soon, she might shatter the fragile progress Ella had made. When Saturday arrived, Maya decided to return to the park, not with any plan, not with any certainty, but with the restless hope that perhaps lightning could strike twice. She dressed Ella warmly, took her by the hand, and drove herself again. No chauffeur, no company car, just her own trembling determination. When they arrived, the park was alive again, filled with the laughter of children. And there, by the swings, she saw him. Daniel Evans, pushing his son higher into the air, his deep laugh carrying across the playground. He looked different under the sunlight than he had in her memory, more ordinary perhaps, but also more real. His jacket was frayed at the cuffs, his boots scuffed, and yet his presence radiated the same unshakable steadiness as before. Ella spotted Marcus before Maya could react. Without hesitation, she tugged free from her mother's hand and hurried toward him. Maya's breath caught. Ella had never run toward another child before. She had always clung to her, hidden behind her legs, refused to engage. But now she moved with purpose, her bunny bouncing in her arms. Marcus grinned and waved as though expecting her. "Hey, you came back," he called. Ella didn't reply, but she smiled faintly, and for Maya, that smile was a treasure greater than any deal she had ever signed. Daniel turned at the sound of Marcus's voice, and when his eyes met Maya's, he offered a nod. It was not a smile meant to charm, not the false courtesy she was so used to from men in her world. It was simple acknowledgement, as though he saw her not as a CEO, not as some untouchable figure, but simply as a mother. Maya found herself walking toward him, each step heavier than the last. She was not accustomed to this kind of vulnerability. She knew how to command a boardroom, how to face down rivals, but to thank a stranger for something so intimate felt strangely daunting. "Good to see your daughter again," Daniel said when she reached him. His voice was calm, steady, with that same warmth she remembered. Maya inclined her head. "She spoke last week, for the first time in 2 years. The words caught in her throat, and she had to look away to hide the emotion threatening to spill over. Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, then softened. "That's wonderful. She's stronger than she realizes." Maya hesitated, then added, "I don't know how you did it." Her tone was sharper than she intended, as though accusing him of some trick. Daniel didn't flinch. "I didn't do anything special. Kids, they don't always need fancy answers. Sometimes they just need someone who listens differently. His simplicity disarmed her. She was used to people overcomplicating everything, layering problems with jargon and strategies. Yet here was a man who spoke as if truth could be that simple. She glanced at his son, who was now showing Ella how to build towers in the sandbox. "You're good with children," she said after a pause. Daniel shrugged. "I've had practice. My boy's been my world since his mom passed." The statement hit her like a quiet hammer. She looked at him fully now, seeing the lines on his face that spoke of battles fought without applause, of grief endured without fanfare. There was no self-pity in his tone, only the quiet strength of a man who had accepted life's cruelty and chosen to keep going anyway. For a moment, Maya felt a pang of something unfamiliar, envy, perhaps. She had everything the world deemed valuable: wealth, influence, power. Yet she could not give her daughter what this man gave his son so effortlessly: laughter, lightness, a sense of being safe in the world. The children played on until the afternoon sun dipped lower, and when Marcus tugged at his father's sleeve asking for ice cream, Daniel chuckled. All right, but only if you're ready to share a scoop with your new friend." He looked at Maya. "Would you and your daughter like to join us?" Maya froze. She had not been invited to something so casual in years. Her schedule was always filled with luncheons at five-star hotels, dinners with politicians, charity galas. Ice cream at a neighborhood stand was almost unthinkable. Yet when she glanced at Ella, she saw her daughter looking up at her expectantly, clutching her bunny tightly but not recoiling as she once would have. In that moment, Maya made a choice she could not explain. "Yes," she said softly. The walk to the ice cream stand was short, but it felt like crossing into another world. Children darted past them. Couples strolled with dogs. The scent of grilled food wafted from a nearby vendor. Maya felt strangely exposed without her entourage, without the armor of status she usually wore. Daniel, by contrast, looked perfectly at home, greeting people with nods, exchanging easy words with the vendor who handed over cones dripping with melting sweetness. He bought two, handed one to Marcus, then looked at Maya as though consigned. "Ring. What does your daughter like?" Maya blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She was so used to assistants knowing every detail of her daughter's preferences that she hadn't been asked directly in years. "Vanilla," she managed. Daniel ordered it without hesitation, handing the cone to Ella with a smile. "Here you go, champ. Vanilla's the classic. Can't go wrong with that." Ella accepted it timidly, licking the edge as Marcus urged her to try faster before it melted. They sat on a nearby bench, and Maya felt the clash of their worlds more than ever. Her coat was too fine for the sticky bench, her watch gleamed under the sun, and she knew she looked like a woman out of place. Daniel, by contrast, leaned back easily, savoring his cone as though there was nothing more important in the world than this simple moment. Maya struggled to relax, to silence the voice in her head listing the 100 emails waiting for her attention. "You don't slow down much, do you?" Daniel asked suddenly, not unkindly. Maya stiffened. "I have responsibilities," she replied quickly. "Thousands of people depend on my decisions every day." Daniel nodded as though he understood, but then said quietly, "Sometimes the ones who depend on us the most aren't in boardrooms. They're right beside us, waiting for us to look up." The words landed like stones in her chest. She glanced at Ella, who was laughing softly as Marcus made faces with his ice cream cone. It was the first time in years she had heard even that faint sound of joy from her daughter. And Maya realized with a pang that Daniel was right. All her power, all her wealth, had not given Ella this moment, this simple, fleeting joy of friendship and play. By the time they finished their cones, Maya felt both grateful and unsettled. She thanked Daniel curtly, her pride unwilling to let her linger, and gathered Ella to leave. But as she walked away, her mind replayed his words, his ease, his presence. Their worlds were impossibly different, and yet somehow, for Ella's sake, they had collided. And Maya could not deny the truth that terrified her most of all. She wanted them to collide again. Healing the silence. The following days settled into a rhythm that Maya had not expected. What had begun as a single chance meeting at the playground grew into something she found herself returning to, again and again. Each Saturday, she would dress Ella warmly, hold her small hand, and drive to the park with a quiet anticipation she refused to admit even to herself. And every time, Daniel was there. Sometimes he arrived with Marcus carrying a ball tucked under his arm, sometimes with a book, sometimes with nothing at all except his own easy presence. Yet each time, it was enough. Ella would drift toward Marcus instinctively, her shyness giving way to small but growing bursts of play, while Daniel, always patient, always steady, would find subtle ways to weave her into the world she had once retreated from. What amazed Maya most was how little effort it seemed to take him. Specialists and therapists had given her detailed strategies, reward charts, structured speech exercises, clinical environments where every word was analyzed and noted. Yet none of it had cracked Ella's silence. Daniel, by contrast, did not approach her with charts or rules. He crouched beside her in the sandbox, told stories with toy trucks and stuffed bunnies, and laughed when she so much as pointed toward a tree or shook her head at Marcus's antics. And slowly, word by word, Ella began to answer, first in whispers, barely audible, then in fragments. Yes, no, may, st. They were not full sentences, not yet, but to Maya they were miracles. Maya found herself watching more than participating. She would sit on the bench, her hands folded too tightly in her lap, her expensive coat pressed neatly around her as though still guarding herself from the world. But while she sat in silence, her daughter was breaking hers. Each time Ella's lips formed a word, each time her eyes lit with something unspoken, Maya felt her own chest tighten with a mixture of awe and guilt. She realized slowly, painfully, that she had been so focused on fixing her daughter that she had forgotten what it meant simply to be with her. Daniel, a man with no resources, no degrees in child psychology, no corporate empire behind him, had given her more in 3 weeks than all the money in the world had managed. It unsettled her pride, and she fought against it. One evening, after another visit to the park, she sat in her office staring at the skyline, her desk littered with contracts awaiting her signature. She told herself Daniel's presence was only a temporary catalyst, that Ella's progress had been coming anyway, that she had set the stage by bringing her to therapy and providing every advantage. But deep down she knew it was a lie. It was Daniel's presence, Daniel's voice, Daniel's gentle way of treating Ella not as a patient to be cured, but as a child to be cherished, that had unlocked her voice. And Maya, who had spent her life controlling every outcome, suddenly found herself facing something she could not buy, could not demand, could not schedule into a calendar. Her growing gratitude warred with discomfort. She was not used to needing anyone, least of all a man whose world seemed so far below hers. And yet, she kept going back. One Saturday, as the air turned crisp with early autumn, Daniel brought a guitar slung across his shoulder. Maya raised an eyebrow when she saw it, but said nothing as he settled on the grass, strumming soft chords while Marcus and Ella clapped along. His voice was deep, rough-edged but warm, and he sang a simple folk song that carried across the playground. To Maya's astonishment, Ella began to hum, softly at first, then more confidently, as Marcus urged her on. The sound was thin, imperfect, but it was music nonetheless. Maya covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she forced herself not to break down in front of strangers. Daniel glanced up at her then, his gaze steady, and in his eyes she saw no triumph, no gloating, only quiet encouragement, as if to say, "This is her gift, not mine. Let her have it." After the song ended, Maya found herself walking over despite her instincts. "You play well," she said, her voice sharper than she intended, the armor of her pride still firmly in place. Daniel chuckled. "Not really. Leah, my wife, she was the one with the real talent. I just play enough to keep the memories alive." He said it simply, without self-pity, but the name lingered between them like an invisible thread. For the first time, Maya allowed herself to imagine the depth of his loss. the years of carrying both grief and fatherhood on his shoulders. It stirred something in her she had long suppressed, a recognition of strength forged not in boardrooms, but in the quiet battle of surviving life's cruelties. Their worlds collided again when Daniel asked casually, "So, what do you do for work?" Maya hesitated. She was so accustomed to people knowing her name, her reputation preceding her, that the question felt almost alien. "I run a company," she said lightly, deliberately vague. Daniel nodded. "Must keep you busy," Maya nearly laughed at the understatement. Busy was an ocean she was constantly drowning in, yet the way he said it, without awe or envy, disarmed her. It was as though he truly didn't care whether she ran a lemonade stand or a Fortune 500 empire. For Ella's sake, their meetings became more frequent, and while Maya clung to her reserve, Daniel simply kept showing up with the same steadiness. He taught Marcus and Ella simple games, sang with them, showed them how to toss a ball back and forth. Each interaction left Ella speaking more, laughing more, daring to step outside the cage of silence she had been trapped in for years. Maya, watching from the sidelines, felt both joy and unease building in equal measure. She wanted to thank him, to explain how much he was doing, but gratitude came hard to someone who had built her life on self-sufficiency. And then came the day when everything shifted again. Daniel had taken time off from work, too much time as it turned out. His foreman pulled him aside, warning him that if he kept disappearing on weekends and leaving shifts early, there would be consequences. The construction site could not afford slackers, and loyalty was stretched thin when bills needed paying. Daniel nodded grimly, torn between the steady paycheck that kept Marcus fed and the fragile progress he was witnessing in Ella. That night, he sat at his small kitchen table, Marcus asleep in the next room, staring at the stack of bills piled on the counter. His hands, rough and blistered from days on the site, clenched into fists. He had promised himself he would always put Marcus first, but now he was pulled into helping a child who wasn't his own, a child who nonetheless had begun to feel like part of his circle. The following week, Maya noticed something different in him. He was quieter, heavier, his easy smile harder to summon. She asked, cautiously, "Is something wrong?" Daniel shook his head, unwilling to burden her. But Marcus, unfiltered as children often are, blurted, "Dad's boss is mad because he keeps leaving work early." Maya stiffened. She understood instantly. His time with Ella was costing him dearly, and for the first time in her life, she felt powerless in a way that money could not directly fix. Yet power was what she had, and instinctively she reached for it. Later that night, alone in her office, she made a call. With her influence, it was not difficult to find the name of Daniel's company, the site he worked on, the manager who controlled his hours. A quiet donation, a whispered word, a deal struck over an unrelated contract, and suddenly Daniel's job was secure. The foreman was instructed to give him flexibility, to overlook the absences. Maya thought she had solved the problem neatly, cleanly, the way she solved a business crisis. But she did not account for the one thing Daniel valued more than money or power: his pride. When he learned what she had done days later, his face hardened. "You went behind my back," he said, his voice low but steady. Maya bristled, her instinct screaming to defend herself. "I was helping. You were about to lose your job, and without it, that's mine to fight for." Daniel cut in, his jaw set. "I don't need someone swooping in to fix my life like it's another project on your desk. I've built everything I have with my own hands. Don't take that away from me." The words struck her like a blow. She had meant only to help, to ensure Ella would not lose the one person who had given her voice back. But Daniel's anger revealed something she had not considered, that her world of influence, of control, was not always an asset. Sometimes it was poison. That night, Maya lay awake in her penthouse, staring at the ceiling, Ella's small form curled against her side. For the first time, she wondered if she had been wrong all along. Maybe healing her daughter wasn't about money or power. Maybe it was about something far simpler, far harder: learning to let go of control. The choice that changes everything, The tension between them lingered for days after Daniel discovered what Maya had done. He still came to the park for Marcus's sake, and Ella still drifted to him instinctively, but his words to Maya were fewer, his tone distant. She hated it more than she expected. She told herself she had only been trying to help, that she had used the tools at her disposal the way she always did in business. But deep inside, she knew Daniel was right. In her world, power solved everything. In his, dignity meant more than any favor she could buy. It was a clash of values she did not know how to bridge. Ella, however, seemed blissfully unaware of the rift between the adults. She was speaking more each day now. Small phrases, hesitant sentences, sometimes whispered into Marcus's ear, sometimes offered shyly to Daniel. Each word was like a sunrise after a long night, and Maya found herself torn between joy and jealousy. Why did her daughter open up so easily to him? Why not to her? At night, she would lie awake listening to Ella's soft breathing beside her, wondering if she had failed not just as a mother, but as the one person who should have been her daughter's safe harbor. One Saturday, the breakthrough came. The park was crowded, filled with families enjoying the first true warmth of spring. Daniel had brought a frisbee, and Marcus dashed across the grass chasing it, calling for Ella to join. To Maya's shock, Ella stood, Bunny clutched tight, and ran after him. Her steps were clumsy, her voice small but clear-eyed. She shouted, "Wait for me!" It was only 3 words, but to Maya it felt like the world had shifted on its axis. For a moment she stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, tears threatening to. Daniel, standing nearby, had seen it too, his face lit with pride, not for himself but for Ella. He crouched as she came running back, her cheeks flushed, her eyes brighter than Maya had seen in years. "You did it," he said softly, his voice steady as he looked her in the eye. "See? You're stronger than the storm." Ella beamed, and for the first time in years laughed. A clear, beautiful sound that rang through the air like music. Maya broke then. She could no longer hide behind pride or control. She walked over, knelt in the grass, and pulled Ella into her arms, sobbing against her daughter's hair. "I'm so proud of you, baby," she whispered over and over, her voice breaking. Ella, trembling but smiling, whispered back, "Mom." It was the first time she had said the word in nearly 3 years. Maya's heart shattered and healed all at once. She clung to her daughter as if afraid she might vanish, as if the moment might dissolve if she let go. When she finally looked up, her eyes found Daniel's. He was standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable but his gaze steady. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, 2 people from worlds so far apart, bound now by the fragile miracle of a little girl's voice. Maya stood slowly, still holding Ella's hand. Her pride, her armor, all the walls she had built over years of climbing to the top, they all felt suddenly meaningless. She walked to him, her voice raw but honest. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You've given me back my daughter." Daniel shook his head. "She gave herself back. All I did was be here." His humility only made her tears fall harder. She wanted to argue, to tell him how wrong he was, but instead she whispered, "I couldn't have done this without you." There was silence between them, filled only by the laughter of the children. Finally Daniel spoke, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You don't have to do everything alone, Maya. Sometimes strength is letting someone else in." The words pierced her. For years she had believed that needing no one made her strong, that independence was the foundation of success. But standing there, with Ella's small hand wrapped in hers and Daniel's steady gaze holding her own, she realized how wrong she had been. Real strength wasn't in building walls. It was in having the courage to let them fall. The weeks that followed were different. The rift between them slowly healed, not with grand gestures but with quiet presence. Maya began to open up, little by little, sharing fragments of her world while listening to fragments of his. She learned of the nights Daniel had spent at his kitchen table, staring at unpaid bills, yet still finding a way to smile for Marcus in the morning. He learned of the endless pressure she faced at the helm of a corporation, of the loneliness hidden beneath her flawless public image. They came from opposite ends of life, yet in their honesty they found a surprising common ground. Both were fighting, in their own ways, to protect their children from a world that could be cruel. The true turning point came one evening when Maya invited them both, Daniel and Marcus, to her home. It was not a grand gala, not a staged dinner. It was simply pizza boxes spread on the kitchen counter, the children sprawled on the floor with crayons, and the adults sharing stories over paper plates. Maya felt awkward at first, so unused to her home being filled with casual laughter, but Daniel's presence was grounding, his easy humor softening the edges of her perfectionism. Ella, to her astonishment, spoke more that evening than she had in the past year combined, her words halting but growing stronger with each one. She even whispered "thank you" when Marcus handed her a slice of pizza, sendins, Maya into silent tears again. It was then, as she watched her daughter giggle with another child for the first time in years, that Maya realized this was what she had been missing. Not the therapists, not the clinics, not the corporate strategies she had tried to impose on her private life. What Ella needed, what she needed, was connection, humanity, the simple, steady presence of people who cared. Months later, the story of a mute girl who spoke again might have been told clinically in reports and progress notes, but for Maya, it was far more than that. It was the story of a woman who learned that her empire meant nothing if her daughter's laughter was lost. It was the story of a man who had already lost everything once, yet still gave without expectation. And it was the story of two children who, in their innocence, taught the adults what it meant to be family. The final piece came one bright afternoon when the four of them returned to the park. Ella climbed the slide, her bunny tucked in her arm, and at the top she turned back, her voice clear and steady as she called out, "Dad, watch me!" Both Daniel and Maya looked up instinctively. Daniel blinked in surprise, then smiled warmly, his heart swelling. He glanced at Maya, unsure if the word had been meant for him, but Maya, tears glistening in her eyes, squeezed his hand gently. "She meant both of us," she whispered. And for once, Maya Carter, the woman who had built her life on power, control, and independence, did not feel alone. She felt something better. She felt like part of a family. Ella laughed again as she slid down, running into their waiting arms. She looked up at both of them, her little hands clutching theirs tightly, and in a voice that was no longer hesitant, no longer broken, she said a single word that sealed everything: family. The world around them seemed to quiet in that moment. The empire Maya had built, the struggles Daniel had endured, the silence Ella had lived in, it all seemed to converge into a single truth, that sometimes the greatest victories are not in boardrooms or battlefields, but in playgrounds. Sometimes the bravest choice is not standing alone, but letting others stand with you. And sometimes the most powerful word of all is not success, not wealth, not even victory, but simply family,